Hello class, today we're going to go over editing for documentation of artwork and exhibitions. I'm going to be using three programs: Adobe Bridge, Adobe Photoshop, and Camera Raw. This isn't intended to be a really thoroughgoing introduction to these programs, but rather a tour of the functions that are specifically important to editing artwork documentation. So I have three files that we're going to look at. Um, and first I'm going to open up Adobe Bridge. Bridge is a file management program that works really, really well in concert with Camera Raw and Photoshop. So I have my three files that I want to work with today. I move them to the desktop. So I'm going to choose desktop. And here's one photo that you saw in the demo video on documenting work, and you can see it needs quite a bit of editing. So in Camera Raw, you get a preview of the image, and you can also see all of the details about the image down here. This is called metadata. And this is a raw file. If you remember from the video, I said that raw files are good for editing. And there's different kinds of raw formats depending on the company that manufactured your camera. These are CR2 files because it's a Canon raw, because I'm using a Canon. And then like if you're shooting with a Nikon camera, for instance, it'll be an NEF file. But any kind of raw file, when you open them in Bridge or Photoshop, an add-on program called Camera Raw will appear. So let's go ahead and do that, and I'll show you some of the functions of Camera Raw. So the idea of Camera Raw is that you're basically taking the photo all over again. The controls for Camera Raw are very similar to controls on your camera. And it is for global editing. Global editing means you're editing the whole photo as opposed to individual passages of the photo. So we're going to edit the entire photo here altogether. So in my documentation video, I talked about white balance, which is the scale of yellow to blue in your whites. And this photo, I didn't quite get the white balance correct because, as you can see, it is overall quite yellow. So if you look over here in your exposure settings on Camera Raw, you can adjust the color temperature. You can see a scale over here from blue to yellow. And so I'm going to move it a little more towards blue until it's starting to look correct. Okay, I think that's a little better. Maybe even a little too blue. If I can bump it back, that's pretty good. Another thing I'm seeing is that I think this photo is overall a little too dark. And there's actually a number of ways to control the relative lightness or darkness of your photo. One is the overall exposure, which I think is, in this case, too low. So I'm going to move it more towards the lighter side. Okay, that's looking better. But you can also zero in on just the shadows, just the highlights, or even the blacks, the deep shadows, or the whites, the really bright highlights. So I think the highlights are maybe a little bright. So I'm going to bring them down just a little bit. And I think the shadows are too dark. I think there's like in this shadow, for instance, you're losing a lot of the detail. So I'm going to bring the shadows up a little bit. Okay, so yeah, now I'm starting to see that the details are coming out a little bit here. There's other functions such as the vibrance and the saturation. To my knowledge, vibrance is kind of a less potent version of saturation, and I think this show had quite a lot of like bright colors. So I'm gonna up the vibrance just a little bit, just a little bit. Um, and so I suggest you go into some of the other functions in Camera Raw. They have a more curve-based exposure setting here. They have some noise reduction and sharpening, and also um, saturation adjustments, and a few lens correction things. These are all things I think I won't go into granular detail on, but they are functions I suggest you explore. Um, so when you're ready, when you've edited the photo, you can hit open image and then it will jump over to Photoshop with all of these edits. Or you can also just save your image as is. If you think it doesn't need any more work on Photoshop, you can hit save image. You'll probably want to save it as a JPEG. You can name it a certain file. So I'm going to name it Lopez documentation. I'll set the folder to the desktop. And I want it as a JPEG because I would probably use it for my website or something like that, because JPEGs are good for screen viewing. I can set the document name and then a 1-digit serial number. I can have other things like the date, serial letter. So I'm going to do 1-digit serial number starting at 1. And then I will save it. And if I go back to Bridge, you'll see it appears on my desktop. And then I still have the original CR2 file. One thing that's interesting about Camera Raw when you're saving files is Camera Raw doesn't actually edit the raw data of your photo. And this is really good because it is what's called non-destructive editing. It doesn't make edits that you can't go back from. Rather, what Camera Raw does is it creates a little text file called an XMP file, which tells your computer how to read all of the edits. And so then when you save it again as the JPEG, such as I just did, then it reads that file, so that XMP file, and saves it with those parameters, if that makes sense. Suffice to say that Camera Raw is really sophisticated because it doesn't do destructive editing. So that's a little introduction to Camera Raw. I'm going to show a few other functions that I think in Photoshop that I think are particularly useful specifically for documentation. So I did a detail shot of the Dan Merva sculptures on the wall, and this is also a raw file, so it automatically opens in Camera Raw. I'm just going to do a few quick edits. I think it's a little overexposed. I'm going to bring it down, which takes my shadows down, so I might bring my shadows back up a little bit. Just some really minor edits. I think I got the white balance correct. So just with those two minor little edits, I'm going to go ahead and open image. And so now I am in Photoshop. It's always better to do global edits, such as I did in Camera Raw, first. And so one thing I'm seeing here, and it's a really common problem in documenting art, is maybe your tripod is not quite leveled off. And I can see if I look at the top of my pieces here, they're not quite straight. And so what I do is that you can go up to the ruler at the top. You can go to view and show rulers. So make sure the rulers are showing. And I can pull down a guide. And as you can see, it's not quite straight. There's kind of an angle here. So I'm going to take my selection tool and go select all or Command A. And so now I've selected the whole thing. And then I'm going to go to Edit, Transform, and Rotate. And so I'm going to keep an eye on my guide here, and I'm going to rotate it just slightly until it seems like they're lined up with the guide. And then I'm going to hit Command D to deselect. And so you can see there's these sort of white angles on the side. I can take my arrow tool and remove that guide. And then I'm just kind of have to crop out with the crop tool, crop out those angles. Another thing I can do instead of doing that is I can use the patch tool. I'm going to zoom in a little bit with Command plus, and I can select that angle by drawing a circle around it. Oh, I didn't quite get it all. Hit Shift, grab that little part too. And then I'm going to grab this section and move it up till it covers a little bit of the wall. And so now it replicated the wall texture into that area. If I didn't want to crop it a little more, for instance. Okay, so now it's looking a little more straight. That's really good. Another thing I'm going to show you how to do is create adjustment layers. And adjustment layers are for the overall appearance of it, like if it's too dark, if it's too light, if you want it to have a little more saturation, if you want to adjust certain colors individually. And adjustments are under Image Adjustments up here. And you can create them as layers. I recommend creating them as layers and not using this adjustment menu because these are all destructive editing, meaning once you make the edit, you can't really go back from it, or you can't fine-tune those edits. However, if you go to the Layers tab down here and you see this half black, half white circle, you can create a layer that performs all of those exact same adjustments. The most useful one I find is curves. Curves show you a little graph of how all of the pixels in the image fall on a scale of black to white. So you can see like the image is mostly light, so most of the pixels are over here near white. And so you can make certain parts of the scale from black to white darker or lighter. So, for instance, if you wanted to make more contrast in an image, which I don't necessarily want in this image, but for the sake of instructions, you would pull the shadows down and pull the whites up, the highlights up, and create an S curve, and then you have more contrast. And so the reason I want this as an adjustment layer is I'm looking at this and I don't quite like it. So I can turn it off by hitting the little eyeball visibility toggle on the side. Or if I simply think it's too much, like, oh, that's too much contrast, I can take the opacity and bring it down to say, 50%. And actually that looks pretty good. So another thing you can do with adjustment layers is apply them to only certain parts of the image. So say for instance, I think this area and this area are too dark, especially after I did my contrast layer with the curves. So I want to bring a little more detail and a little more lightness out of, say, just these two dark areas, for instance. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new curves layer. And these are shadows, so I'm going to pull up my shadows, and in the meantime, I'm going to ignore the rest of the image. I'm only going to look at those two dark spots and ignore what the rest of the image looks like. So they're shadows, so I'm going to pulled the shadows over here up a little bit. And as you can see, okay, more detail is coming out of those two dark spots, which is great. Now, this white box here under the curve that I have selected is what's called a mask. It shows where the adjustment layer is affecting the image. And it's all white right now because it's affecting the entire image. So I'm going to click on it and make sure there's brackets around it. And then I'm going to hit Command I for invert. So I've inverted it. So now it's all black, meaning there's a mask over the whole image. And what I can do is I can paint through that mask using the brush tool. And so I'm going to select white down here because I'm going to edit out using white, because remember, white is what affects it. And so what's great about this is I can select the hardness of my brush. So I want it to be not very hard at all because I don't want a really clear circular mark on it. And you can also change the opacity. So, if I only wanted it to come out about 75%, if I wanted to have kind of a light touch with painting it in, that's really helpful. So you can, another quick move is you can change the size of your brush using the bracket keys on the keyboard. So I'm going to paint in just these two dark areas. And so if you look down here, you can see my marks are coming through the mask. So paint in just the two dark areas. And if I go overboard a little bit, say I accidentally hit some of the wall like that, what I can do is I can change this back to black, or you can hit the X key, and then I can paint that mask back in, and I'm using the bracket keys to change the size of my brush. So I'm going to paint it back in if I accidentally go over the line a little bit. And so now, if I turn that layer on and off, I can see I'm getting a lot more detail out of those two areas. So that's great. I'm going to show you one other adjustment layer that might be helpful, and that's hue and saturation. So I can make my colors more saturated. So let's just say, for instance, I think this green section is not saturated enough. Like I want a little more green coming out of this section. So what I can do is under my hue saturation layer, master, and then pick greens. And I think there's a little bit of cyan here, so I can actually include a little more cyan. So I'm going to raise the saturation a little bit, and I can see that a little more saturation is coming out over here. So that's good. And if I wanted to do a little bit of overall saturation, I could make another layer, and I can up the saturation a little bit. And what I can see is that, I think I went a little too hard on this yellow, so then I can take my black brush and mask it in a little bit so that that yellow is not quite as affected because it was a little too bright. Yeah, it's very subtle, but there's a slight difference. So I think this image looks pretty good. I think I've done a lot of good work with it, so I think I'm ready to save it. So I'm going to go to File, Save As, and again, most likely this is going to go on my website, or I'm going to use it in my portfolio for an application. So it's meant to be viewed on screen, so I'm going to save it as a JPEG, and it's by Dan Merva. So I'm going to hit save, and I want it to be the maximum. Okay, so it's saved. So I'm going to go back to Adobe Bridge and get the last image that I have here, which was that overall shot um, that I showed you in the video about documentation. So open that up. So yeah, it's a raw file, so it comes in on raw first. Um, just looking over it, I think the shadows could maybe come out a little more because I'm looking down at this corner and I'm looking at this shadow right here. So I think maybe we could get a little more shadow. And I actually think it's maybe a little yellow, so maybe I'll just make a tiny adjustment to the white balance, give it a little more blue. Okay, that looks great. So I'm going to hit open image. So here I am in Photoshop. So the main problem I'm seeing here is a really common problem if you're photographing in a tight space and your lens causes a little bit of distortion. If you look here at the baseboard, it's bowed a little bit. That's called barrel distortion. And it's really common, yeah, if you're shooting in a small room to get a little bit of that. So I'm going to pull down a guide again and sort of put it across the baseboard. See, you can see how it's dipping down right here. So there's an easy way to fix that. So you go to filter and lens correction. And you'll go to custom. And as you can see, there's geometric distortion. And so you can sort of tighten the center or you can bulge the center out. Our center is already bulged out a little more. So I'm going to pull this towards pinching the center. If you go too far, you'll know you'll get the opposite problem, which you can see here. See if you go a little too far. So, but we want to just affect it very subtly. So I'm going to put it at +1. Very subtle. I'm going to put it at plus. Also just enter a number, +1. So it looks much more straight now. So that's good. So hit OK. I'm getting a little bit of my same problem as the last image where the tripod wasn't quite straight, so I'm going to hit select all by hitting Command A, and then go to edit, transform, rotate, and rotate it until it looks pretty even across that that guide that I pulled down. Yes, perfect. Okay, hit enter, and then I'm going to hit Command D to deselect. I'm going to pull away my guide, then use the crop tool to crop out the little resulting angles. Okay, and hit enter. And so the final thing I'll show is, say you are photographing on a wall that has a lot of marks on it. You can get rid of those in a few different ways. What I'm seeing here is similar. There's little paint blotches from a bad paint job on the wall down here on the baseboard. So I'm going to hit Command+ to zoom in on them. So I'm going to get rid of some of these, and there's a few different ways. There's one I showed you before, which is the patch tool, where you draw a little circle around it, and then you grab that and move it towards an area with the texture you want. Here's another example. Maybe I'll grab these, pull them aside, and then there's a beautiful algorithm that really makes it look natural. Okay. Another thing you can do is the clone stamp tool. I think the clone stamp tool isn't quite as algorithmic, but it copies things exactly. So you hit Option and you set a little target, and then it paints that target over the spot you want to get rid of. Okay. And another one, which is probably the simplest, is the spot healing brush tool. It's under the same section as the patch tool, which is where you just draw over it and the algorithm does the work. This one is the easiest, but it's also the most prone to mistake, so I don't use it quite as much. But with really simple things like these dots, it works really well. And then I will do the same. I will save as, and I will save it as a JPEG for screen viewing. I'll save it as overall shot onto the desktop. Great, so those are some basic functions that'll get you pretty far in editing the documentation of your work. If you have any questions, you can email me, dfloyd@saic.edu. Thank you so much.